Good morning. I'm Dale Fye, and I'm the chapter president of the Access Users Group, Eastern Time. And today we're going to talk about crosstab forms and reports. So why do we use crosstab queries? Basically, it's to aggregate data across one or more row idea headers and one or more column headers. Although generally, most people do only a single column header. And then we perform some sort of aggregation of the data, whether it be a count or a sum or an average. I mean, you can use any of the statistical functions to do that. The problem with crosstab queries, though, is presenting the information to users. You know, if you're just using it yourself, if you're writing a query and just so that you can generate an Excel spreadsheet or something like that, then it's the only real limit there is the column limit. But if you're using a crosstab query to try to display information to a user in your application, you have some limitations. You can simply display the results of a query, which I generally don't do, but it provides some additional functionality and some ease of use that a data sheet and a continuous form don't take. You could use a data sheet. I like data sheets. A lot of people don't like data sheets and would prefer to use continuous forms. But I like data sheets because they give me a lot more functionality with regard to the right-click menus on columns, so I can filter and do a number of other things with data sheets that are more difficult with continuous forms. And then there are continuous forms, which have some, from my perspective, advantages and disadvantages. Other issues that you might encounter with a crosstab query are gaps in the data. A lot of times when we do crosstab queries, we're generating column headers that are date-based. At least that's a frequent way I do it. I don't use crosstabs for a lot of things, but aggregating data across dates is critical. And sometimes you'll want to display those. You'll want to display all the columns, all the dates between A and B, and the data might not actually contain data for all of the dates. So sometimes you have to figure out how to fill in the gaps in your data so in order to display all of those columns and not have missing columns. And the other thing that you can't really do with a crosstab query, but you can do with data sheets and continuous forms, is that you can develop a function which allows you to drill down into your data. And I'll talk about that and show you how I do that in my applications as well, or I'll give you a simple example of how I do that in my applications. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull up my Access database. So what I did for this demo and for an article I'm writing is I went ahead and generated a bunch of employee sales data. And basically I created a half a dozen employees, and then I generate newest employee sales just generates data for a 3-month period and randomly generates random numbers that select the employee and the date, and then generates another random number that indicates the amount. So what you'll see in my table, this is what my table looks like, and there's 1,000 records in this table with various dates from March 1st through May 30th or 31st, whatever that is, 30. And then they have an amount. And for a very simplistic look at this, we would just generate a simple crosstab query that that looks like this. We're just joining the employees table because I want all of the employees, and we're to the employee sales table, and we're just pulling in the sales date as a column header and the sales amount, and we're summing the sales amount in this query to display all of that information for all of those individuals. And this is what the data looks like, and that works great so long as we only have 3 months worth of data. But like I mentioned before, if you have more than 255 columns, you're going to get an error when you run your query. So you have to be cognizant of that when you're doing crosstabs, and ensure that you limit the date span of the query to less than 255 columns. So that's a simple query. Then you could generate a form, and this is basically a datasheet form, design view. And what you'll see that I've done to create this datasheet form is I've added a whole bunch of controls, and they have, if I can find my properties tab, the labels all have a name that starts out with label and a 2-digit number. That's because in this case I didn't expect to generate more than 100 records or 100 columns going from 0 to 99. And the text fields all have a header going just text 00 through 0 whatever. The downside of this is generating this data sheet worth of data. Now you can do it with a query, run your query, and then just create data sheet from the query. But it will, when you do that, it's going to give your controls different names, and it's going to automatically fill in the control source of those controls. So what I generally do if I want to create a data sheet for displaying crosstab queries is I'll write a very short procedure which uses the create control method, and I'll just run, create however many controls. I'll put it in a loop and create X number of controls. In this case, for this particular sheet, I think I only did 31 controls. So basically enough for every day of the month, a standard month. Although this first 00 is going to be for the employee name, so I should have probably done 32 controls on this form. But as you see, these are all unbound. So in order to get those bound, you have to execute some code, excuse me, when you load the form. And basically I have a function, I call it format crosstab, and I use it for both forms and reports. And I just call that function, and that function goes through, and the first thing it does is it hides all of the controls. Because in some instances, I don't have as many fields in my result set as I do in the form. So in this particular form, we've got 31 records. If I did a query that only had 15 column headers, I don't want to show the other 15 columns. So first thing I do is I just hide all those controls. And then the next thing I do is I loop through the record set, and I set the caption property of the label to the field name, and then I make it visible. And then I set the control source of the text box. So here's the text, and then my loop counter, and then I set the control source of that, and then I make it visible. So with this simple function, I can easily format this data sheet so that when I load it, it goes through and very rapidly adjusts those column headings. And you'll see that they're all in the right order, and they go out to the 31st. Sometimes you'll have and one of the things, if we go back and look at that code, let me pull up that code module here real quick. Let's see, go back here to the basic data sheet. You'll see that sometimes you'll have a column heading which has where the record does not have a value in the field that you're using as your column header. And what happens in that case is you get this column header that has a greater than or equal sign as the column header. And in this case, I've just hidden that, and that's what this does. And then the other piece here that I didn't mention before was the way that this particular load event works is once it's done the reformatting and it's hidden that first column, then it sets the focus back to the first element, which is the employees column, and runs the AC command freeze column. That way we can, when we run that, you'll see that when I scroll left and right, the employee name stays in its place. And I don't know whether everybody knew that feature was available or not. But if you right click on that column, you can see freeze columns and unfreeze columns. If we unfreeze it, the other thing I want to do is see if that unhide column, there's my 31st. So I can, if I want to, I can select all three of these, right click and freeze columns, and then I'll continue to see those three columns while I scroll. Basically, it's the same functionality as you would get with a Excel freeze pane feature. So that's a real useful feature if you're not familiar with that. All right, any questions so far?
I personally use a form with 255 fields and always use that one and hide all the things I don't need. So I don't need to create the form all over. I have just a static subform, which I generally use for that.
Try that again. I'm sorry, Klaus.
No, I just said I use a fixed subform for that with 254 columns or 55 columns, and always hide the ones I don't need. So I don't need to create the form each time.
Gotcha. So, there are some advantages to having the data sheet form, but when you do that, you're right. It does it's kind of limiting. It takes a lot of work to build that form, but that's just a functionality I found is useful, and I'll go into that here a little bit more here in just a second. So so that was just a basic Crosstab form. I mean, it's just a form, a data sheet based on that information. And this particular one is a data sheet, so it's limited to the number of columns or controls that I built into the data sheet. So we'll close that. We can go a little bit more advanced, and apparently my pop-up form scrolled over to the other page. And I left this information for generating new data up here just on the off chance I wanted to do that, but that's not really important in this case. So what I did in this case was I created a form wrapper around a subform. Sign view. Okay, so I've got a subform that isn't instantiated yet. It's just sitting there, and then I've got my main form, which gives me the option in this case to display a couple things, and that's I probably would not have this display option up here on a normal application. I would just define the data source or the source object of this subform. But for this application, I wanted to be able to jump back and forth between a couple of different configurations. So right now what this is showing is basically that data sheet that we just looked at. If I go in here and unhide columns, I can unhide the 3-1, and the employee column is still locked, but I'm limited to that data sheet. So again, I'm limited to basically 31 controls. I've got a continuous form here, and the reason for the continuous form was I wanted some additional functionality, and this gave me this is set up basically the same. It uses the exact same code as the data sheet does with regard to formatting the headers, but it only does it basically only does a week at a time. And I can jump. I can scroll individually one day at a time, or I can jump to the end, or I can create buttons that jump anywhere in between. But I've used this on a number of cases where clients just weren't comfortable with working with the data sheet. They didn't want their people being able to hide columns and those kinds of things. So inadvertently, so I use this methodology, and this just gives you a little bit more control. You can, depending on the width of your form or the width of your monitor and the whatever, you can build as many columns in here as you want and just adjust these one day at a time. You could modify these left and right buttons to jump 1 week at a time or whatever, which is probably makes more sense than anything. And then right now I've got these set up to jump to the end and jump back to the beginning of that form. The other thing that a lot of people don't realize they can do is you can actually make a query the source object for a subform. So if I do that, now I've got my query in here. This is the query instead of the data sheet. Obviously, it looks just like a data sheet, but it gives me the entire data set that I'm working with rather than just the 30 columns that I had in the other version of it. So that's if you want to be able to display up to 255 columns, then this is kind of what I think what you were doing, Klaus, was displaying your query in a subform on your form. Is that correct?
Sometimes I use all different things. I combine that. Yeah,
okay, good.
It's a little bit more advanced,
Gotcha. Okay, so say that, and then I've got this one. It's called a really advanced crosstab, and the difference between that one and the other one is that in this particular case, I'm building the query that I use to display the information at runtime. Rather than just using a canned query that gets all of that sums the values. I've got this one set up so that I can change the type of query. So now I'm looking at, this is the average number of average sales data for each sale made by each of the employees on a given day, or I can count the number. And instead of doing this by day, I could do it by week, or month, or any other period you wanted to use. And here's an example of where I apparently did not call the element of code that goes through and hides all of these unused columns that are in the data sheet. But that's how that works. Now the advantage of one of the advantages of a data sheet is that I'm going to go back here and do this by week. Is that I can actually put a function. Let me go back and show the design of this data sheet. Let's see if we can do that. Close this real quick. If we open up this data sheet, oh, wait a second, is this not the right one? Oh, this is basic, excuse me. Yeah, that should be there. Oh, here we go, because it's not in the employees. So what you'll see is if I select all of these except for the employees, what I've done is I've created a function and assigned it to the double-click event of that control. So now when I pop this up, and maybe we'll do this by week. Now if I double-click on one of these cells, what you're going to get is a message box. It's going to give me the ability to do some drill down, and you can do this in a you can display the information in a form, whatever you want to do. But by double-clicking in here, what I do is I capture the name of the control that I'm using. I capture the employee name that's associated with that row, that record, and I capture the date associated with that cell as well. And by doing that, then I can run a query which actually returns the records associated with that that date and whichever. Let me change this over from a sum. Let's make this a count. Because then what I should see here is if I should do, let me close that query, close that. If I do Donna here, wait a second, something's wrong now. Oh, there we go. I'm doing this by week, so I messed that up. I didn't take that into account when I did this. So all it's given me here is the data for the 22nd. So I would need to modify my drill down function so that if it takes into account how I'm viewing the data and sets the criteria appropriately for that. But in this particular case, if we do by day, for example, and I click on here, that doesn't change because it's already open. If I double click in here, now I'm going to see all those individual records that are associated with Wayne. And instead of just opening that query, I could open a continuous form that would let me look at those individually, or some other. I could generate a report. Right? You could do basically anything with that. And I've got that same setup configured for the continuous form. So if I go in here and do the continuous form, I get that same set of information. What was that? Let's see here. What else do we have? Close that. Okay, I think that pretty well covers that aspect of it. Now, one of the things I wanted to, I mentioned when we were talking about the slides was the gaps in data. And I'm sure most of you guys are already familiar with doing Cartesian joins. But let's just say we want to do a date range from the 1st of March until the middle of June. Is everybody familiar with tally tables? Let me explain a tally table in case you're not. Basically, it's just a table of numbers. In many cases, it will include both numeric values and dates. Personally, I prefer to create a single table called numbers, table numbers. It only has 10 records and only a single field. But with that table, I can create a query that gives me all of the numbers from 0 to 100, or I could modify that query, add another copy of this table in here, call it thousands or hundreds, and then go down here, modify this.
May I?
May you what?
No, just interrupt you. I have a table, I call it date table, and have for each single day between 1990 and 2100, for each single day, a record. And that I have once, and that record also contains continuous numbers. But I can also then use that table for date calculation.
Gotcha. Yeah,
as well as the numbers.
Yep. That's close this. That's very similar to what the next thing I was going to show you is, which is my query dates. And in this case, I do not have the number in there, but if I throw the date number in there, what I have here is I just use the DateAdd feature. And in this case, I'm adding from March 1st, but you could make that a variable that you call via a function and stick that in there. And when I run this now, that's basically what you've got in your table, except it's for a specific date range.
Yes and no. As I have the holidays and the other dates, for example, week numbers, and so in that table as well.
Gotcha.
It's better to have a fixed table than a query, because I can add infos to that day, to a single day.
Correct. Yep. That's why I originally said a tally table. A lot of times I'll do what you're talking about, but for most instances, I just prefer to work with this particular setup with this table numbers, which I can then create a query out of, which generates anywhere from 10 numbers up to thousands or more records, and I can start the date on a particular date rather than having to go all the way back to what'd you say it was, 1990?
Yes.
So I don't have 100,000 records in my table at any given time. All I have is the records I need, and most of the time when I'm working with dates, I'm working with date spans that range in the month or months, as opposed to across vast numbers of years. But I can see where but I can, that's why I mentioned the tally table to begin with, is because I do know people like you who have got a tally table that has a numeric value, a date value, a day of the week value, so that you don't have to look that up every time you're doing something. It's just right there in that table. And like you said, holidays. I generally, if I'm going to worry about holidays, I generally create a holiday table, which allows me to create whatever holidays I want and set them up.
Germany is much smaller, but it has several counties. So I have Bavaria and I have Hamburg and so on. And they have different holidays in each country of within Germany.
Right.
Within part of the country. And so that table is better for me, because I can say from January, in January the holidays are in Hamburg, and in February they are in Bavaria.
Right.
And I couldn't do that. without the telltale.
Right. Gotcha. So at any rate, I've created my dates query, which gives me all of those, the 100 days of dates starting on March 1st.
Yeah.
And then to get my list of employees and every date that's associated with those, so that I fill in all of the gaps, I just create a crosstab. I just created a Cartesian join between the employees table and my dates table. Now, in your case, that would have millions of records, but you could easily, put a criteria in the criteria box here.
I do it with a query instead of the table itself, because
right.
I have always front and back end, and if I have a table in the back end which has 60,000 rows in, well, it's sitting there. It doesn't be buried, if you don't use it. And I always use query for the actual dates I need.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
And then
I had the idea from Itzig Ben Gunn, so.
Yeah, I hear you. And then to fill in the gaps, what this query to the query employee sales dates 100 basically gives me that list of all the employees and the 100 sales dates starting on March 1st running outward. And if I join that to my employee sales and build the crosstab from there, it generates the data sheet that looks like this. And what we find is we don't have any data for those last 10 days, but they are included in the result set. So if you had data where you were missing data for a particular day, maybe it's a holiday, you don't have any data for that day, but you want that date to appear on your form. Maybe you don't do any sales on Sundays, but you want that date to show up in your data set. Then creating that Cartesian join between your employees and the date span that you want to include, and then linking that to the table that you're gathering your actual sales data from on employee and date, you're going to get every employee date combination during that date span. Then the other thing I wanted to show you was the code that I'm using in the background of that second set of data that I think it was in here. Nope, I thought it was there, but it's not. Let's go here.
But there is also the method in VBA for if you want to create empty cells.
Correct. Yes. Yep. And you can do that in the pivot clause of your query. So what I wanted to do is show you how I in that form where we selected the number, whether it's the days of the week, a day, month, or year, and and whether I wanted to use a sum, sum, count, or average. This is how I did that. Basically, I took the query itself and broke it up into pieces. So here's the select part of the query. And this is basically, I'm using this as a variable, that aggregate piece, and it's wrapped by brackets so that I can do a replace later on in the function by the appropriate function that I want to use. And so this is the select part of the query. And then based on the value in that view by dropdown, either by week, by month, or by year, by week, by month, or by day, I basically set what that pivot criteria is. And this function just takes the date and converts it to the first day of that week, so that it groups on that. And that's the function I needed to use when I was doing that right-click drill down. I should have called this function in my query so that it returns that set of dates. If we're doing by month, it just uses a format. It just uses a format command to format by date and pivots on the month or the year and the month. And in this type of a case, I'll always do that with year as the leading with years and month, so that it sorts properly. Otherwise, you'll get month 1 of 2020 followed by month 1 of 2021, and then month 2 of 2020, etc. So I always do the year and month format when I'm doing that. And like you said, and in the other case where I do it by day, it just does by date. But like Klaus mentioned, the other thing you can do is you can actually build your in clause here as well. So you could run a query that says, give me all of the days that I'm doing, and you can build a string right there that says this is the elements that I want in my my result set, my column headers. So that it'll include all of these things, even if there's not a record in the database that corresponds to that, etc. So, and then basically I replace the aggregate piece that from up here at the top with the value of that combo box, sum, count, or average, and then I just set the SQL value of the query def to that SQL string. And then I reopen the form. If you try to reset that SQL string of that query while the form is open, you'll generally get an error. So I undo the source object. I clear it out. Then I repopulate the SQL string, and then I reestablish the source object of that subform so that it very rapidly updates that and displays that information. That's pretty much
the query anyway.
What's that?
If you're doing the query def setting, it includes a requery, which is quite important, I think.
Well, I mean the setting the source object achieves that as well, because basically you're taking that form and you're detaching it from your main form. That subform is being detached, so it's being closed, and then
that's what I mean.
The SQL statement. Oh, okay, gotcha then. And then when I reset this, then it does that requery and gives me the data that's associated with this SQL string as opposed to the previous SQL string.
And if you're in a form, you always get to the first row.
Try that again.
Because it includes a requery, you always set to the
yes.
first.
Correct. The focus always goes to the first record. Right. Yep. All right. That's all I have for my briefing. Does anybody have any questions about how I'm doing these things? And oh, wait a second. There is let me open this again. Form view. I forgot that I do actually have a report configured as well. Now, the problem with reports is I don't have any of this scroll functionality. You can change this. I don't have any of this functionality built into the reports. Theoretically, I guess with a report view, because report view has events associated with buttons, you might actually be able to create a report and view it in report view and give you this same functionality where you can reset these. But I don't think so, because the reports are pretty finicky as to when you can actually set the control source of a control. In this particular case, I think I had to do it in the form open event, because I was getting, if I tried to do it in after the form had loaded, the control, it gave me an error that said I could not reset the values of the controls. So I'd be interested in knowing if anybody
the report is only at open. You only can open, you can create a report without a source and set the source once at on open, but you have to be careful to always do on error resume next, because it tries to open the record more than once.
Right.
The report more than once.
Yeah, actually, in this case, go ahead.
I think the report is best done if you do a group report and say, okay, if it's it has to do with dates, you group it by the date and do the normal selection, first month, second month, and so on. But,
Yeah, go ahead, Klaus.
each one down the other.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that's probably a good point. In this case, where I only had 6 employees, I could very easily have used the employees as my column headers in my report, and gone vertical with the dates, which would make a whole lot more sense, because then I wouldn't have to worry about formatting it at runtime. The way this is set up is if you look, I've got code in the open event which basically calls that same function that I called in the datasheet and the continuous forms to set the control source and the caption of the columns in there. But the downside of that is, like I said, you've got a limited number of columns. You can obviously create your report to print on 8.5 by 14 or 11 by 17 if you've got if you've got a printer that has that feature, but you're going to have a limited number of columns with that. And I've never really had a need to do more than what this particular report does. Where usually I'll do a report that shows like a week's worth of dates, which will generally all show up on the same form. And but because I don't know what those dates are ahead of time, I use this function to reformat those controls. Now, what one of my MVP peers does, instead of generating, let me do this, instead of generating the query, instead of generating the query with the column headers that actually have the date in them, he actually generates it and does a DateDiff. So he'll do this. Let me close that. We'll copy it. So what he'll do here, instead of using the actual sales date, he'll do a DateDiff here.
Doesn't it make sense to have in the first column the employee, in the second column the first date, and in the third and following the crosstab?
I've never done it that way, but that might work. I mean, obviously you may have done that. Here's what he generally does, is he has it set up with like this, so that his column headers are just the numeric values, etc., like that. The advantage of that is that column header now is identical basically to the name of the control. But if you're going to do one of these where you try to scroll it left or right, like I do in my continuous form, then it's immaterial. So it really doesn't make much difference. I generally prefer to have my crosstabs so that they actually show me what the value of the field is as the column header, as opposed to a more abstract number that I then have to translate back into a value again on the other end when I'm actually displaying the information. So that's
But if you show that sort of difference days to the first one, I prefer to show the first one as a fixed row between the employee and zero.
So let me hold on a second. Let me just go ahead and create a new design, and we can talk through that, Klaus, because I don't quite know what you're talking about there. Okay, so we've got our sales date, and we got our information here.
Yes, I mean
we want the employee.
Yes, and now you have a second fixed. That's row here. The next one, no, the column here, and it shows the start date, just with a fixed start date.
Okay, so
not as part of the pivot, but as a fixed part.
Okay. Okay. I got you. So you're basically us.
Yes. Like that, and not part of the pivot, but part of the fixed.
And then you would do like I did, which is using the DateDiff.
Yes.
Okay. So DateDiff.
And then you fix the employee and the start date, and then you can scroll and you see the start date +7 or +0, whereby the first column 0 is always the start date. You know what I mean?
I think I do. I think I know what you're talking about here. So what we get looks like this. So you've got the start date, and then this incremental value that off of that start date, theoretically.
Yes.
Is that what you mean?
Yes. Or you can set the you begin the pivoting with 1 and set the 0 to the start date in the header. That's also a possibility.
Gotcha. Yeah, that would be an option too. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to do this, and then, like you said, especially if you're displaying the data in your subform in the form of a query like this, then you can get as many rows and or as many columns as you want, up to 254, I guess it is.
I think if you're doing direct the queries, you can have even more. I don't know, but I've heard that saying that that if it creates the query creates more than 250 columns, you can show them, but you can't edit them.
Interesting. I've never actually tried that, and
me too.
And it may be based on the version of Access you're running too that might limit you that way. It might be the later versions may be more flexible with regard to that than earlier versions. I mean, as you can see, I'm running 2007 right now. That's what I've still got on my base computer. I've got VMs for basically every version after that, but they take up too much memory, and they're memory hogs when I'm trying to do this.
You know that memory patch for 32-bit versions of Access?
I do. You're talking about for the large address aware piece of stuff, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I did experiment with that a little bit after, I think it was Peter. Was it Peter Deering that posted that, or was it
Carl?
Carl. Yeah, Carl. Yeah. And actually, he talked about it in one of my user groups a couple last year. And I'm glad to see. I don't know whether you noticed or not, but the Access group did mention in their in one of the recent posts
that it will come.
Yeah, that they're going to.
How many versions back? So
yeah, I don't think it will go any versions back. I mean, they might do it for 16, but they're not doing a whole lot of updates for anything prior to 2019 or 365, whatever you want to call it. So, that's part of the reason. For example, I still use my my linked table manager that I wrote and I've briefed a couple times because I've got most of my clients are still running 2010 or 13, and possibly even and possibly even 16.
Yeah, I'm using 13.
Yeah, and so my linked table manager is just so much better than the one that's built into everything from 16 backwards.
Yeah, I have also my own, so I know what you mean. So
yeah.
Because everybody has his own ideas of how to link automatically.
Oh yeah. Does anybody else have any questions? Comments?
I'm sorry to interrupt you so often.
No, that's, I mean, I was done with my briefing, so I was, the discussion we've had over the last 10 minutes was fruitful. Providing people with other ideas on how to do things possibly.